Welcome back to the Nameless Book Club. Today we're going to be talking about part 2 of The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. We both accomplished the reading, which is a plus. And so let's go ahead and start with a summary of what happened. So this would be the moment where if you're tuning in for the first time here, spoiler alert, we're going to ruin the whole book. That's part of what we're doing here. So tell us what happened in part 2, and then we will jump right into just commentary, analysis, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so part 2 opens up with the Empress coming aboard a Federation ship. A person by the name of Tyre, or Tyr, we're not sure, is already
My
waiting
brain
aboard.
pronounced it Tyr.
Yeah. It's Tyr, so, best guess there. He's hiding, apparently, in the shadows somehow, with the power of his goddess, waiting for her, and we see this meeting where she gets on board the ship, and then she kills him.
Hang on. Did you notice that part 2, she just kind of smashes the magic in your face right off the bat, and then it's present throughout the whole second part in a way that, given the sort of almost total muggleness of the first 200 and some pages, I actually did not think that it was a positive addition, the way that she did it. How did you feel?
I was glad to see it because ultimately, let's be realistic here. As the sci-fi guy, that's what I want out of fantasies. I want cool, showy music, or cool, showy magic. Although music is always fun. And so not getting any of that in the beginning, but having hints of it was frustrating. And then, just right in the beginning here, just bam, right in your face. We've got 2 powerful shamans and this strange tryst on a boat, and it just goes from there. It was a welcome introduction for me because it made it more of what I was looking for. But in the overall narrative, it's sort of a disruption, and it doesn't really fit what came before. It feels almost to me like these were 2 separate stories that suddenly were put together for some reason.
Yeah, I would agree there. Another thing that stuck out to me was I'm unsure what she was trying to accomplish with this section where you almost could have called that first chapter the prologue to the second part. It very much to me read almost as though it could have been the prologue to the book itself, almost as though maybe it had been written first and that the whole first section was meant to sort of set up that whole deal. But I may be wrong there. I have no idea. But the Empress is vilified, I guess, in a certain sense. Or was that your take? Because she kind of shows up and then just murders her, head spy for what appears to be almost no reason.
At the very least, it changed her in my mind from a positive, glorified Empress to a much more complex character, a much more, there's more going on, there's more subterfuge, more subtlety here than just she's this high Empress that everybody worships. So it brought her down to a more realistic level, I guess, for me, but not necessarily a strict villain. Because I don't know, for me at least, I didn't read it as though this is an act of just straight villainy. I think it had more the hallmarks of a strategic move, especially given what follows as a result. So it's hard for me to pin that on her as you're a villain.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps vilified was the wrong word. Certainly, I think it made her look ruthless.
Yeah.
In a way that was, in contrast to the first part. And the grit in the second half is much more pronounced. It really did, I think, feel like a completely different book. From the first page of the second part. And that's taking into account the full section, not just this first scene, even though that's what jogged my memory on this comment. The whole section, to me, read like something that was only connected to the first part in narrative, not in tone, style. The methodology of the scene building and of the world building is quite different in the second part. And I feel like where there was some nuance in the ideological setup that was happening in the first part, I feel like the second part was much more ideologically troublesome, which we'll get to later. So those are my general, thoughts as far as that first moment where we go from everything focusing on the one character and narrating her storyline up to this moment with Jang at the end of part one, and then we get this hard turn where now she's doing a more omniscient narration style where now we're totally disconnected from our protagonist in a way that correct me if I'm wrong here, there is no other part like that in the first section. Yeah,
not that I'm aware of. I think at least so far, if I can sort of jump the gun, like overall what we've read in part one and part two, I think it's evidence of her progression as a writer, if nothing else. I think that if you compare, essentially the last parts of this and some of her descriptions and her characterizations and such to what we get in the first part, you can see that she's developed. You can see that the writing has become a little better, a little more complex, just sort of in general, and not like a vast night and day. But I think of
it sounds like we disagree.
Yeah, I was gonna say I feel like it moved. I feel like she moved the goalpost a little further out into the slightly better writing area. But like, I'm not talking. This for me was not an extreme change. But I noticed this section had a lot more descriptions. It had a lot more details. It had a lot more. For me, I think there was more interaction between the characters that wasn't just strict like sidekick and hero, or they didn't follow a very set pattern of like this. Because let's be realistic, like most of the characters in the first part could have been anyone. They could have been any name, could have been any gender, and it really wouldn't have mattered because like they had a set role to play.
Okay.
Whereas here, I feel like that starts to shift more. Not that it completely changes, but I think it develops a little better. Yeah, you think so?
Yeah, definitely. Because I would have made the same argument about the second part, where at the school, I mean, for me, we just moved from one sort of easy story starter to another easy story starter. Mm-hmm. Where in the first part, it was Harry Potter. Kid realizes that they're special. In this case, it was the amazing child who this is a huge common thing in fantasy that I'm not a fan of, is this special child who manages to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and leave their the squalor and suffering behind just because they were willing to work harder than the other destitute people around them. I feel like that is an unescapably conservative underpinning, and it doesn't matter how liberal you are. If you start with that basic idea, the ideological component of your narrative is already putting you at a disadvantage. And that's my informed opinion, I guess. But so for me, we trade the school experience for the X-Men, Incredibles, Scooby-Doo.
Well, yeah, there's that part of it, but I mean, I think you're also missing.
Well, it's not that part of it. That's the whole underpinning of the second part is her describing this ragtag group of it's the Hardy Boys. It's.
Yeah, but you're missing the fact that we also get a lot more description of scenery. We get a lot more description of what the characters look like. We get a lot more detail in general overall, just of very specific, for example, towards the end, there's this scene with the seer.
You think she describes humans better in the second part? Because I don't. She describes some monsters.
She described like Alton for the first time. Like other than talking about his eyes, I don't remember any descriptions of him at all in the beginning.
There's descriptions of his skin and of the, but I'll grant you that the descriptions of Altan or Alton, it's going to be Alton for me because Alton Brown.
Yeah. But I mean, like then we also get descriptions of the rest of the team, particularly because they take on aspects of their god and so forth, and like we get more description overall of what the city looks like, what their architecture is like, what the lay of the land is like. I just feel like overall, and it wasn't a vast, like I keep saying, it wasn't vast night and day. Like we went from no description.
Right. Well, you're arguing that she got a little better, and I'm arguing that she stayed the same. So we almost agree. I just don't. I think that any improvement that I saw in the syntax or in the individual scene, I thought was outweighed or equalized at least by what I would argue are some of the ideological oversights and a couple things that I thought were just kind of outright intellectually questionable.
Yeah.
And so for me, I just can't go with you on that. And also, name me a character and then describe them that isn't the protagonist or Altan. Or one of the people that was present in the first section, and it has to be a human. And I don't no descriptions of their monstrous qualities. Like, tell me what kind of human look they have.
What about Kara or Quara or Quara?
I don't know what she looks like. What color's her hair? What color's her eyes? What's her complexion? Is she fat?
Hair and eyes? I don't know, but she tells us like, oh, she's a little shorter than me, and she's kind of lithe and. I envision almost more like I'm envisioning like Rin as like a young woman, and then this Kara character is a little younger, a little smaller, like essentially a similar looking character overall in my brain.
Okay, that seems pretty vague.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that it was like, oh my god, night and day, which is what I keep saying.
Well, we don't have to belabor
Whereas,
this.
like in the first part, what did
we can fight? We can fight if you want.
Yeah. But I mean, what did Kite look like? Did she ever tell you tall, thin, fat, young, blonde? I mean, we didn't get.
I don't know. You're the one that's saying that the descriptions got better, and my counter to that point was.
But like Suni, large, tall, big, muscular, ape-like, because he's the one that goes.
That's my point.
Baji is shorter, round, fat, like. But we didn't get any of that at all whatsoever with any of the characters from the beginning. Like, what did Irha or Iraj or the strategy master, like, what did he look like?
No, I'm not saying that it was happening in the first part. I'm just not agreeing with you that it is happening in the second part. She didn't have any hooks like she does in the second part. Of course she's going to describe the X-Men, because the fucking story's about the X-Men. It's not important to describe the individual characteristics. I mean, this is true of Harry Potter as well, and of the magicians, and the focal is the school.
Yeah.
And so,
although to be fair, like I came to the Harry Potter books after watching the movies, so I didn't even think about it because I just inserted like, Snape is the guy from the movie, Harry Potter is the guy from the movie, like. So
now she gets around to describing all of them, but my point is, yes, there are more descriptive phrases relating to these new characters, but she had to. I don't think that's an indication that you have a more powerful writer writing the scene here as opposed to in the first part, which we've already talked about how this is a very young writer, and the book is very high quality.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I don't know. So I don't see the progression. I almost feel like that this was the part that was written first, is what I said.
Yeah.
Meaning that, like, I almost thought the writing was better in the first. Go ahead. Sorry, we must be having a little bit of internet lag because we're normally we don't talk over each other, so it must be a lag issue.
Or something, yeah. I was just gonna say. So ultimately, like, we're just sort of arguing semantics.
No, definitely.
Yeah. Because, like, I'm not saying, like, it's better per se. I was just saying, like, I felt as though I got more detail, more description, and that I was pointing that to an indicator of maybe she's progressed a little bit in the writing. Okay. But ultimately, when you put it as a necessity of here's the X-Men and here's this strange town, like, yeah, you kind of have to. So that does begin to make more sense in that context. I do feel we forgot one part, though, that we did in the last video. did your rating change? Before you said it was four
Oh,
and a half.
okay. Well, yeah, we'll throw it in. What was my rating last time? I feel like I gave it a 4.5.
Yep, a 4.5 Amberites, where I gave it a 6. Would you come down on that? Would you come up on that? And then at the end of the discussion, we'll see if our discussion has changed us again.
I give part 2 3 Amberites.
Now, are we just talking about part 2 on its own, or the whole book so
Part
far?
2 on its own, like in comparison. I thought that part 2 was ultimately less enjoyable than part 1.
Yeah, and I think I'd have to agree. And again, maybe I'm just...
I read part 2 because I had to for the show. I read part 1 because it was really cool.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe I'm just the good guy here. Like I'm the good cop, you're the bad cop. Like I'd give it a 4.5, 5 maybe.
Okay.
Just for part 2.
Maybe it's that liberal university indoctrination that's got me. I'm being overly skeptical. If you hate me now, wait 10 minutes. Because I've only alluded to my criticisms so far. I haven't even actually made them yet.
Yeah. So after that, and this is literally just the first chapter. So after
So let's move on with tell us what happens next.
Yeah. So Tyre or Tyr, whatever you want to name him, he dies, and then as a result, his death sends out shamanic waves through the empire, and all the shamans realize, oh no, there's been a death. Which
did you like the disturbance in the force?
Yeah, I was like, ugh. Yeah, I was not a fan of that necessarily.
It's pretty common in fantasy, especially they'll say, if it's an important member, the highest ranking wizard or sorcerer or whatever, when they die, I've read lots of phrases like, and the whole world shuddered for a moment because even the oldest of gods recognize when such one as this passes, etc., etc.
Yeah. So there was that part, and also at the end of this first chapter, the Federation invades the Empire, and then they march straight inland to Seingard, however we're saying that. As a result of that march, Rin and the fellow students start evacuating the city. They start moving the official government from there to this place called Golan Nis, I think is how it's pronounced. My confusion, I never understood that Seingard was the capital. I guess I knew that it was an important city, and maybe she even said it was a capital, but it never seemed to stick in my brain that it was the capital.
It is mentioned, but it isn't. I don't feel like the Empress is there.
Yeah, that was the weird part for me. Is like, okay, I knew there were some bureaucrats there, and I knew like some of the warlord kids were there and whatever, but like, is the royal palace there? Like, where's the Empress? Like, does she just live in town there, or?
Yes, this is another thing that Brandon Sanderson did better.
Yeah. So it was strange to me. That
That's not a knock on Kwong.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's Brandon Sanderson. So, what are you gonna do?
And then once they empty the city, Rin then has to fight this general. In their defense of the city when the Federation arrives. The big event of all this was that she's fighting this general of the forces, and she calls upon the Phoenix and literally melts him. Also, Nezha gets stabbed for the first time of several. It's that for my complaint for the whole section 2 is Nezha. That guy, like, I was really happy to see that. Oh, look, they're being forced to work together, and it's really early in, and like my prediction was right. And then I quickly wished he had just died.
So here's where I'm gonna start, and people are gonna instantly probably make their decision on whether they agree with my approach to these novels. If you're expecting on this channel and this show for me to applaud war porn, it's not gonna happen. I studied Ursula Le Guin far too long to buy into the idea that good fantasy is just people crushing each other's heads and popping their eyes out and burning each other, and you have to earn that type of scene. Otherwise, for me, it's too transparent. And I felt like the second part was really gory without almost any payoff. And it seemed really contrived. Like you sat down and said, okay, or like that whole thing where they set that town on fire, and you can just kind of tell to read it that they sat there and they're like, okay, we haven't done animal cruelty in a while. Let's throw that in. So there's that problem that begins to rear its head. But there's this whole, throughout the second part, she treats Nezha, is that how we're saying it?
That's how I was saying it. I don't know how that's actually pronounced.
Nezha is treated as though there was this character one time that was mean and a douchebag, and then he went away for a long time and experienced war. And it changed him as a man. And then he met the person that he was mean to long ago, and they made amends and became friends. But it hasn't been a long time. He's had one battle, and he got stabbed. And then what? Then he recovered, and now he's... I don't know. It seemed so contrived. Really, I agree with you. It was if not the weakest choice, I think, narrative-wise, that was made in this novel so far. It's right up there because I wasn't able to suspend my disbelief. It went too far.
Yeah. And I mean, spoiler alert for the rest of it, which we're getting there anyway, but like, he just keeps getting knocked down, thrown around, made unconscious. Like, he's just this puppet sidekick that gets beat up, and then Ren gets to come in and save him again. And I was like, oh damn, she's literally just going to kill this guy right off. I really wish she just had. Because now that, like, she's established he's just the puppet that gets beat up so that Ren can be the hero, like, I just sort of hate him. And I really just wish he wasn't in the narrative.
I totally could have bought it if, there was this battle moment where she realized that when the chips were down, he was an immature kid at school, but he steps in and fights for her because she's, on the same side. And then they, perhaps they're able to set aside their childish ways as a result of, like, one of them almost died. And they did see battle. I could buy that. But just the instant where, there's just this one scene where he offers this apology and she's like, yeah, now he looks sincere. And so therefore, well, we're besties. It was too fast. It happens, there's not enough pages between when he's a douchebag and when I'm supposed to buy that our main character has had this change of heart. But she doesn't show us any of the interim. It's just A, B, and nope, I didn't like it.
Yep, nope, neither did I.
What happens next?
So after that,
and of course you haven't mentioned yet, but she's joined the CK, the Psych.
Yeah, I was literally just about to say that. So as a result of her melting this general, she gets locked away in the basement for a while at the school until the masters decide what to do with her, and they end up saying, "Okay, you're special or whatever. You go join the Psych, the bewildered children or whatever they call them, the stupid 13th freak show."
Yeah. Oh, and division. It's also revealed that Jang is the
gatekeeper.
The gatekeeper.
Yeah. Well, it's implied anyway. I mean, it was pretty strongly obvious that, like...
I thought, don't they just literally call him the gatekeeper? Doesn't the Empress...
The Empress says, like, oh, the gatekeeper's gone, but if you weren't an astute reader, I don't know if you would always catch that she's saying that, like, Jang is the gatekeeper. Because they don't specifically say, Jang is the gatekeeper. So, like, I'll give some credit if you're a poor reader, like, you might have missed that. But, like, spoiler alert, he's the keeper. And we also have an implication of who the tortoise guy is, if I remember right. He's still around somewhere. That got implied too.
The horrifically named trifecta.
Yeah.
Another thing that shouldn't have made it through the editing floor.
Yeah. So she ends up getting put into the Psych, and, surprise, surprise, Alton is her new commander. And they train, and they kind of become buddy-buddy, and they go from there to this coastal town called Coeur d'Alene? I don't know.
Coeur d'Alene sounds cool to me, but...
Yeah, that's how I would have said it, so... She meets the rest of the X-Men and learns a little bit about all their powers, except for the one who is mysteriously not present for the vast majority of the time, even though, like, super annoyingly, Alton always asks, or someone of the X-Men always asks, like, hey, where's the missing friend? So that got a little... I was tired of hearing that question, because it's like, how many times are you going to ask this? And like, yep, we know there's another member that's not here.
Yeah, and if you're noticing that we're not being nearly as nice as we were in the first episode, I typically am pretty generous with the first 100 or so pages of a book, because I understand that it's important to have a digestible, publishable, sellable introduction to these books that needs to be a little bit more formulaic, I would imagine, unless it's, glorious in its virtuosity. But generally speaking, I'm going to be nicer to the first couple hundred pages. But if you set up a bunch of ideological problems, as this first section does, as the number of pages that remain in your book dwindles away, I become more and more worried that you're not going to be able to make a cogent and useful statement of ideology, and that you're just going to perpetuate status quo norms that are either bad or mischievous in some other distinct way. So that is why we're at page 400,
something like that.
Is that, and the book is 500 and some pages long, so we're over 70% through, and none of the ideological problems have been solved. And yeah. I think that's why at least my criticisms are a little bit sharper. But I'm sorry, I cut you off because I wanted to be clear about that for the listeners.
No, that's fine, because I was also frustrated that at the very end of section 1 we get some implication of, how to use this power, what it is, etc. And she kind of introduces these ideas, and then pretty much this section just completely does away with all those questions. And it doesn't matter. It's just about, we need to weaponize this power. She doesn't really care about the ideological problems or the philosophies. It's just like, I just need to learn how to be a fireball throwing, berserker, which that was kind of disappointing.
Yeah.
And so where were we? She joins the psych. They go to Coeur d'Alene. They meet the X-Men, all that. And then pretty much the rest of the story is just about defending this city. There's an instance where they go out of the town and they attack this set of small boats and steal some of the supplies and drive the Federation off. And then the Federation comes in with a peace offering, and it turns out that it's just explosives, and they blow up a bomb in the middle of the city.
Here's my problem. One thing to point out is the June, I think is his name.
Yep.
He, after the Psych go out and sabotage this fleet of ships, and there's this battle, etc. And they bring in they're bringing in the cart. June is calling for them to just massacre him, just kill him, all of them. And the reason that he says is because it'll bring pride into the conflict. And then he flip-flops.
Oh, no. He said the Alton's attack on the ships.
Oh, yeah, pardon me, I misspoke. Yes. Let me go back. So my issue is that the June tells them that the attack that they do, where they sabotage that fleet, that's going to bring pride into the war. And then he turns around and wants them to massacre what appears to be a surrendering group of soldiers that are brandishing the white flag, as though that type of an action isn't going to bring not only pride but also revenge, and it'll make you look like a villain, and a bunch of other things that are going to make the war much worse. I feel like that was sort of an error in continuity. And the emissary does say that we're trained that our lives don't matter. And so that is kind of a way out of the idea. I guess it's kind of a loophole that she makes, where maybe June is still right. Like, they wouldn't care that they murdered people with white flags. because they don't care about the individual. But I just felt like June's response was really weird.
Yeah, and I felt like the emissary saying oh, our individual lives don't matter. That was really more of a foreshadowing of the bomb exploding, and less of a
Right.
As you put it, less of an excuse to be able to just kill them without ramifications. Yeah, that scene, it was just kind of, I don't know. For me, it was just kind of meh. I think it was supposed to be like a surprise, like, oh no, the enemy attacked, but like this whole section is all about this stalemate between the two sides of this city, and how they each keep kind of pushing the other, and so like I didn't expect it in the sense of I didn't think that the surrender party was going to be a sabotage or Trojan horse, as it were. I wasn't surprised when it was, but I knew that like this attack that Alton made against their reshipment fleet would in some way follow with a response from the Federation. So it was kind of formulaic in that sense, but I mean it made sense. And then after that, ultimately, it just comes down to there's some monster that appears in the city, and Rin implies that this Chime, is that what it is? A Chimmy? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
It steals faces, and it's a shapeshifter thing. She kind of implies that it's in the world now because Jiang, the gatekeeper, opened up the void, and this is one of the costs that have to be paid when you use power.
Sort of cool.
Yeah, sort of.
You weren't into it?
I feel like she already tossed this sort of, it seems, even though she keeps saying like, remember, when you use power, there's always a cost. She keeps saying that, but then like there's never actually a cost.
Yeah, I don't really understand her magic system. I don't like it. And I also don't fully understand what she's trying to get at with the Pantheon.
Yeah.
Generally.
Yeah, it's all kind of strange. I hope the last part clarifies that to some extent.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm okay with the idea that there has to be a cost, but it doesn't have to be so one-to-one as, insert a battery and then the cost is that the battery is expended, or that there's a direct, immediate negative consequence. It's okay if there's some temporal space in there between action and cost.
Well, if you remember in the last episode, I talked about how there's the possibility for an engagement with, critique of, discussion of the concept of Wu Wei, the acting without enacting, a concept from Ursula Le Guin, that is present in Ursula Le Guin. It's a concept from Taoism.
Yeah.
But and also the idea of the will to power and so on and so forth. I thought that perhaps an engagement with those ideas was forthcoming, but some of the stuff that's happening in the second part leads me to believe that maybe we're more in the realm of just kind of a, war smut kind of entertainment fantasy thing.
And then, so for me, that I didn't buy into the oh yeah, this monster is here because of Jiang opening the void. Not yet. It seemed really vague and just kind of a I'm gonna throw that in because I mentioned it in the beginning, but like, nah. I hope that that's just a foreshadowing or a setup for further instances of like, this is the cost of the power. Otherwise, it's just kind of weak, and I didn't care. And of course, when they fight that monster, Nezha gets knocked down, and she has to save him again. And then the city ends up getting evacuated. And
did they evacuate? Because I thought they're just running from the monster.
Well, yeah, it wasn't an intentional evacuation. Like, yes, they're running from the monster, but then the city empties. The people flee. The people say, like, fuck this, we're not sticking around, we're out. Which, I mean, it's an evacuation of sorts. Like, it's not the militia saying you have to get out. It was the people saying we're getting out. And she finally, we get to see the missing X-Man guy, Chagahan, something like that. He shows up, and he's the seer who tells the future and has the direct connection to the gods and yada yada. So she takes this psychedelic trip with him to banish away this mysterious woman that's been blocking her from the Phoenix. And then they nebulously go to this divine altar hexagon thing where she throws some coins and tells the future, so that immediately following that they run
Well,
to
I don't know.
Alton.
I want to point out, and take this with however you want to take it, I guess. I don't know if the derision is appropriate for, because you've kind of been mocking the monster and now also the bone, or the hexagon reading and whatever. I assume these are probably elements of Chinese culture. They're probably
Yeah, it's not that I'm
folk tales,
deriding the
so-
culture or their existence at all. It's that given that this whole narrative has had almost none
But
of
I'm saying
that
it's not
whatsoever.
probably any cheesier than if she had had a dragon.
Yeah.
And we
And
wouldn't,
it's
we
not-
would not by default go, and then there's a dragon. So my point is, like, I think maybe that's just that it's foreign to us to have that kind of monster as opposed to a dragon or a cyclops or an ogre troll, drow, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there is that element, but it's not that I'm deriding that this monster showed up, or that like I'm hating on the culture or something. It's that this whole narrative, even though it's ostensibly based in Chinese culture and history, it before I appreciated that it wasn't heavy-handed, and now I'm looking at it going, there's basically nothing in this that actually tells me, oh, this is Chinese culture or history or this or that. There was no front loading of any kind. This scene with the monster, like, it could have been any monster of any origin. So I mean, if it is a part of a Chinese myth or something, then cool, awesome. If not, whatever.
Right.
It's not that I'm,
I
mad
was
about
just
that
pointing
part
out
of it.
that there might be a little bit of that blind spot happening for both of us, where we just don't aesthetically care, or we're just not as closely related to that culture, and so
Yeah.
the traditional monsters and situations that are chosen in the fantasy as based on the Chinese culture are probably that they're more foreign than they are, like, because as I said, they're certainly no more trite or cliche than a dragon or a unicorn.
Yeah, but again, my point was, as I keep trying to get to, is that there was no front loading of expectation anywhere with
Right.
any of it. It was never like when we go to this altar room that she names it, and I can't remember what it is, and they're in the in the other world or the pantheon or wherever the heck they are. They go to this location, and I think it's a fascinating, interesting location that, like, I want to know more about what's going on there, and we just don't get any of it, and so there's no preparation that makes that room make any kind of sense, and then it's just kind of a one-off and it's gone. And so I found that frustrating. That's why I'm being derisive, is because it's not like that could have been a really cool element for me, except for it had essentially no explanation or context. And so I just found that disappointing. So then they read the future, they leave. Alton has to beat up some poor prisoner to prove that, yep, the prediction was true. Oh no, the Federation is marching on goal in this. End part 2. And so that was pretty much, I think
Right.
that's
We
the
have
most
to
of what
leave
happened.
this place and go protect the secondary capital.
Yeah.
And I mean, if I can see how you're, if you're spitballing and you're like, okay, I need a framework for what happens in my second part. So we've got, they've left Signgard. Okay, we're going to do a thing where they go to this major port city thinking that that's going to be the major target, but it turns out they're actually sneaking through the mountains. They're trying to attack the main or the secondary capital so that they can chop the head off the snake and start to take the empire over. That's fine. I that's a totally acceptable framework for me for telling the story. I don't think any writer is necessarily compelled to come up with a never before heard of scheme where where the narrative is so complex and so revolutionary that you can barely tell that it's the same type of book. I don't need that in every reading experience, so I'm not gonna knock points off, so to speak, just because the trick of like, oh well, the real target was somewhere else, we have to go save it. Obviously that's been done before, but I want to talk a little bit about the Chaghen. Is that how were you pronouncing that in your brain?
I struggled with it because it's Chaghan, if I remember right. So like Chagahan,
Chahan,
maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think he was another miss. He shows up, and then when they do this Pantheon thing, there's this quip that happens where this being who is haunting Rin, right? That's her name, Rin?
Yeah.
She says to Chaghan, you know, I've dealt with more powerful shaman than you. And he's like, yeah, there is no more powerful shaman than me. And yet, we seem to, I don't know, I feel like that there's a really bad, potentially bad thing happening where I suspicion that maybe there was an attempt at a critique of the male-dominated institutional education system. Because I feel like Zhang and the sort of philosophic element of this is not being... Basically, he gets the short end of the stick. So if the author is trying to set up a situation where she shows us the path of wisdom, and then they go down the path of power, and then she's going to show us at the end how that's folly, and that you should, you know, that balance is preferable to just unleashing the flames of the phoenix. I don't know if she's left herself enough space to do that in a way that doesn't make this book just look at, basically, as I said, war porn. Because a lot of the second part is just people mercilessly killing each other. And there's a lot of nationalism going on. There's a lot of, like, overt tribalism happening. There's a lot of stuff that is really questionable. There's just rampant, you know, continued male on female physical abuse that isn't addressed almost at all. Like, just not at all. No characters decry it. What do you think?
I think you're spot on so far. I mean, the only positive thing I could really come out of this second section is that for some reason it kept reminding me of Glenn Cook's Black Company. It had this sort of feel to it where, like, I get the sensation that, like, oh, we're a besieged army. I get this feeling of, like, yep, we're bunkering down in this city, and, like, I kind of liked those things, but everything else that came with it, like you said, just the rampant war porn and the warlord thing, like, all the warlords constantly arguing, and it was just so stupid, and I just didn't care. I literally couldn't care less about the arguments between the warlords, and that was barely even mentioned. And it was just annoying that it was even a feature at all. Then add in that, like, oh, Nezha might be reporting, you know, whatever Rin says back to June, and he's trying, like, there's this development of, like, this weird, they're spying on each other. I don't know, it was just, everything kind of fell flat here for me in the end.
I feel like we're reading a 700 to 800 page book that got crushed into a 500 page book. Because if the author took the time to really develop, you know, if she gave us a part 2 that was in between the actual part 1 and part 2, where we see Nezha develop and change as a character based on events, and we get introduced to additional layers of nuance with the warlords, perhaps get introduced to more characters within that group and why we should care, and if there was more thought given to the dynamic between the male and female characters, I think that could elevate the story some, and then we could get to this point where the siege is happening and her and Nezha have this different relationship, and so I would understand why they're together more, where they're in more scenes at the same time, so on and so forth.
And like, if I had seen more of the perspective of the seer character, Chaghan, however you say his name, I'd like to know more about him. I'd like to know more about the pantheon and the mythology. I'd like to know more about, you know, the people in this city. Like, the people are just literally, like, completely unimportant to the second part, except for they constantly say, like, oh, we're here to defend the people of the city.
Right.
But then they don't feature at all. They don't matter at all. They're not present, basically,
well, they
at all.
feature to be numbered and killed.
Yeah.
Which I think is again, I'm not necessarily knocking the choice by the author to include any of these elements, because killing off a bunch of civilians is a theatrical and it's a viable narrative choice. But in this case, little thought seems to be given. She doesn't even take the time to give us an actual paragraph where she describes a character's internal monologue in response to the horrific death that has just occurred. She does label it as horrific, generally, but she could have just as easily said, and then a bunch of people die, and it was a lot of people, and you should be sad because lots of people dying is bad, right?
Yeah. And then, and let's not forget, in the first half of part 2, there's this Ramza character who's one of the non-magical, non-X-Men team members who loves explosives. And then at this explosion, for some reason, this explosion traumatizes him, and he doesn't appear in the rest of part 2 ever again. It's like, that bothered me too, because it was like, okay, I get, fine, this one explosion traumatized him, but up until that part, she was this Ramza character, he was the confidant of Ren. And then as soon as Nezha appears, this Ramza character just disappears forever. It's like, where did he go? She introduced these characters, and then they're irrelevant.
Yeah. So, like I said, there's a lot of potential criticisms that could be being made here if the author has the skill level, or alternatively, if the author has the desire to address these issues. But just on the war porn side of it alone, in this second half, I mean, they take a prisoner and, torture him. They unleash the description of the monkey god and the boar god worshippers going out and massacring these soldiers is intentionally grotesque.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's just all of these, I feel like if the author took as much time to think about the ideological situation, and as they do coming up with ways to describe people's heads being popped, or different ways of describing carnage, then I think the story would be better for it.
Yeah.
Unpublished man said about, winner of awards and so on, author.
Well, I mean, to be fair, we may be unpublished, but we've been trained for most of our lives on how to read and interpret these things. So.
Oh no, people, the average reader will probably like this because it's very war porny. You don't have to really think about it a whole lot. It seems like it sort of upholds a lot of status quos. Country is the most important thing, and there's not really a very strong critique of the military generally. And there's several times where the distinction is brought up between, there's philosophy like Jang, and then there's the real world where it's war and you have to unleash the monkey guy to rip the heads off of people. Because this is the real world, sweetie. That's basically the sum up part 2 is drunk husband abuses wife while saying, this is how the real world works, baby. That's basically part 2. No?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little harsh, but
what do you mean? That's most of the drama in the second part is the deterioration of this girl who she just thinks Alton's so hot, and it's so cool the way he can fight. And he can put the fire on his fingers. And then now he's abusing me because he wants me to be like him, and then he does all this shit, punches her in the solar plexus, gives her bruises, so on and so forth. And then when she finally, fails, of course, she doesn't overpower him, she fails to stand up for herself. Then he's like, oh, So that's what it took to get you there. It was an act. You know, I mean, isn't that basically the narrative?
If you're looking at only her relationship with him, then like yes.
I would say that's the primary narrative of the second part.
Oh, well, I would say the primary narrative is the defense of the town.
No, I mean that's like the terminology for these things is relatively lax, at least in all the places I've studied. So I don't have like a special word for
that's the plot, whereas the story is this or something.
Yeah, I mean those are the main bullet points of the world narrative, but the protagonist, the main character that we are following, this is the main development that occurs. Is she joins the CK, and has this interaction with Alton as she is figuring out how to become a brainless, berserking fire monster. And she's not being a merciless killing machine fast enough for his liking, and she uses some of her own words, and so therefore, I mean, literally, she calls her commander an asshole, and then she has another character, the author has another character just say, like, yeah, if you say mean things about the commander, I'm going to have somebody murder you.
Yeah.
So, let me ask my question. Do you think that Rin is a strong character who has agency and who challenges any of the norms of the patriarchal elements of fantasy or of the world generally? Do you feel like that's happening with this character?
No, like not at all. Basically, like the only degree of agency she displayed at all was in the first part when it was like, yeah, I want to escape this shithole and go take this test. But then like she doesn't become the enactor of change. She is just acted upon. Like even when it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna stand up and I'm gonna fight this general. It's not because like she sought him out or because she knew like, oh, if I do this thing, it'll end the battle. It's like he found her and she had no choice. She doesn't join the psych willingly. She doesn't go to Coeur d'Alene because like she thinks it's important. Like she's just this peon pawn that gets shifted around everywhere. So no, I just don't think she has agency. She's not a very particularly strong character aside from like she may have the strong power. Yeah, it's disappointing because I mean I think she could have, especially given the hinting at some of the ideological thinking that we had, she could have been this character that in the second part could be confronting these bullheaded warlords and saying like, no, there's a better way, or there's better strategies, or there's ways that we can do this that aren't just
yeah, like if she took some of the stuff that Jang said, because all she ever does is say, but Jang was my master. She doesn't actually talk about his ideas. She just says, well, Jang was my master, and then she takes that moment to say, ha ha, yeah, aren't scholars stupid? Ha 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 ha, and then she just moves on.
She could have mixed his ideology with the supposedly stellar strategy that she displayed to Irha or Iraj or whatever his name is in the first part, and she could have come up with some brilliant strategy that was, you know, less confrontational, or like she could have used these powers that she had in the beginning that she was praised for in a way that would have been interesting in the second part. And instead she's just sort of this like feckless tool that gets thrown around and manages to succeed where no one else could for basically no reason. Yes,
a feckless tool. Excellent. Yeah, that's spot on. That's my biggest disappointment, I think, with the novel is I thought for sure that a young up-and-comer female author with this dual nationality thing going on and the current climate of the last, you know, politically of the world for the last 4 or 5 years, I thought, man, there's just so much that could have been done in this book to make it really intellectually interesting. And it feels to me like that was traded out for cheap sort of bloodfests that I could write, that you could write, that anybody could write, that you see on TV and in action movies, all over the place. And I am not going to stand here and say that I don't occasionally indulge and enjoy those things. I watched Game of Thrones. I enjoyed Game of Thrones. I get it. But the world's in a pretty bad place right now. And, you know, artists are one of the groups that can have a big impact. And this is a book that is being widely read. And I don't think this is really doing anything good for women.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's
if I
doing...
wanted-
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, if I wanted war porn and I wanted this sort of cultural mix and things, like there's lots of brainless, cheesy kung fu movies. There's lots of brainless action TV out there, much of which I enjoy in my off times where I'm not trying to pursue interesting, important things. I like there's this TV show called Taken based on the movie. It's basically just this guy beating up people for half an episode. That can be fun, brainless entertainment, but I go to Hollywood for that. I go to TV and for that. When I want to spend literally hours of my life in a world, in a book, I want it to be more impactful and more important than,
If you want to play the
real.
real game, the real skinny, I'll get real close to the mic and I'll talk slowly. If you want to be one of the great masters of fantasy, a Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Ursula Le Guin, you're playing a higher fucking game than... And then they squeezed his head and it popped and there was gore all over him and he didn't even wipe it off.
Oh, and then Nezha got knocked down again.
Again. So, yeah, is this up there with other things that I have read for very low prices on Kindle? Yeah. It's better than a lot of that stuff. Because a lot of that stuff is also just really cheesy, vulgar romance. I don't know if smut is the right word. Because I avoid the overtly smut stuff, but I have occasionally read stuff on Kindle where it was fantasy and it was sort of like this, just a little bit shittier. And so, yeah, let's finish. Was there any other summary elements that you wanted to go over?
I guess if I had to be honest, I'm gonna come down on my rating after thinking about it, because I mean it was a fun read in the sense of it was easy, it was quick, it was entertaining in some respects. But as I said, like when I come to books and I want more substance, and this just didn't match up. So I think I would have to come down to a 4 or a 3 even overall.
Yeah, so it was definitely good enough that if I had picked it up in the library, or if I had purchased it, I would have read the first part, and I'm hooked, so to speak. So I would have read the second part, and by now I'm so close to the end that I'm not going to sit here and say it was so bad that I just wouldn't finish it. Even on my own, I would probably finish it, but it would have taken me longer, and it might have been one of those books where I got halfway through part 2, and then, you know, like a squirrel, another shiny thing would appear, and I would move on to something else and then come back to it later. I had to read the whole part for this episode. And it wasn't at all like the first part. It wasn't a joyous, like, oh, it's reading time, I get to sit down and I'm going to enjoy this. It was like, okay, I have to slog through this, even though I think I kind of know what's happening here.
And in our book club adventures so far that we haven't filmed, we've come across some gems. We've come across some meh books, some bad books, and we've had a lot of fun books. And so I think that's part of the fun of this experiment, is discovering new things that were really good. But sometimes you gotta kind of slog through the cheesy war porn. But hopefully, I think part 3 may have some redeeming qualities. We'll see. One can hope, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah, I do want to, as we approach the end of the episode, for those who desire it, I do want to include one actual quotation and then go over it a little bit about this distinction between. I don't want to harp on the author's age, but we do have like a young undergrad age person publishing this novel, so my guess is that probably she was younger when she actually wrote the material. And so you could be talking about somebody who's 19, who hasn't even been in college or is in their first year of college or has, is it summer vacation. They wrote this book after, that type of age range. And so I'm cognizant of a certain derogatory element in the text that is directed at Jang specifically, but at the idea of what the author might perceive as overly indulgent academic philosophy. And there's this part where this is chapter 20, page 395. Jang never taught me about this. That's because you Nikarans are so primitive, said Chaghan. You still think there's a strict binary between the material world and the pantheon. You think calling the gods is like summoning a dog from the yard into the house, but you can't conceive of the dream world as a physical place. The gods are painters. Your material world is a canvas, and the divinatory is an angle from which we can see the colors on the palette. This isn't really a place, it's a perspective, but you're interpreting it as a room because your human mind can't process anything else. So, I read the wrong quotation. Let me see. Yes. Here's the quote that I want. That's a great quotation, though, so we could just talk about that.
Yeah,
I could just leave this in. I started reading it and I was like, oh, is this the quote I wanted? And then I was already doing it and I was like, fuck it, do it live. This quote I think is interesting because while it's not addressing the academic issue I was talking about, it does address the religious element of the text, which at first I thought maybe there was going to be some parallels to Taoism, and that doesn't seem to be what's happening here. And the level to which the agency of the human is overtly challenged by the presence of the gods in the text does lead me to believe that there's not the inklings of a larger, more grand critique of the idea of spirituality, of religion generally. But again, I'm concerned that there's not enough space in the remainder of the text, given the current style and pacing, for the author to close this loophole in a way that is not going to make the preceding text still stand out as being this sort of... so far, I read it as sort of advocacy for the altered mind state, quasi-religious experience. What do you say there?
Yeah, definitely. Because I feel like what the seer here is saying is that I'm Neo and I can see the Matrix and I can stand in different places and see different ways of the Matrix, but you just don't understand it yet because like I'm super powerful and you're not, but like maybe you could be, and so maybe if you got good you could also fly like Superman and see the code of the Matrix.
Yes, and granted it's a series, isn't it? And there's already more books.
There's a second book. I don't know if it's going to be a trilogy or not. I haven't looked into it that far.
But here's the thing. You can't just write a bunch of fucked up shit and publish it and not care what the ideological effects of that text are and think that like, oh, well, I'm going to publish another book and I'll just clean it up later. And I also have never bought into this thing where, like, for example, if you look at Earthsea, one of the things I noticed was the scholarship on the first book out of 5, depending on how you want to cut it. The first book is purchased way more, it's read way more, it's talked about way more. And the reality is that a lot of people are only going to read the first book. And so I feel like it's on the author to be cognizant of the fact that you're not going to get every reader to read the whole series, and you're potentially leaving a lot of people with potentially a counterintuitive takeaway from your novel, from what you think you're going to do in later texts. And I'm worried that that's what's going to happen here. And so let me get this last quote out. This is from chapter 14, page 320. Great danger is always associated with great power. Spider-Man. The classic Spider-Man. The difference between the great and the mediocre is that the great are willing to take that risk. Alton's face twisted into a scowl. Jang was a coward, scared of what he had unlocked. Jang was a doddering fool who didn't realize what talents he had, what talents you have. And so, for me, this is the most irksome line of criticism I think that exists in the narrative. And maybe Kwong is trying to make an argument that is in favor of Jang in the end. But I feel as though the opposition to it, because she doesn't really challenge it. She's like, well, he was my master, but, I mean, he did, try and prevent me from becoming a literal fire demon from hell. And so that's less cool. So therefore, there's just really not a big advocate in the story for the wisdom of balance, the necessity of intense study, the importance of philosophy. There's no advocate for that position aside from Jang, and he's not present enough in the text for his imprint to go on to the reader's mind as they are then seeing all of this counter to that position in the text proper and in the events that take place. Because even if she says, like, oh, wisdom is good, but then she gives us a bunch of war porn. And that's what the reader is taking away, is that many of the events are extremely violent in ways that are not, intrinsically productive, so on and so forth. And so that's my final criticism is, I see her position on religion being sort of weird and potentially it has the potential for being resolved poorly. The same thing is true of her distinction between the sort of Jang academic philosophical side and the Alton / everyone else in the story sort of quasi pragmatism / cruelty violence thing. That dichotomy to me is very dangerous in the terms of how is she going to resolve all of that in like 130 pages. And then there's the issue of feminism and the female protagonist and agency. And I also feel like the author is failing on that. So those are three big criticisms that I have laid out, that I hope I have laid out to some degree over the course of this show. You look like maybe you had something you want to throw in?
Yeah, I saw a few YouTube reviews that I'm going to watch later, but most of them had titles like, this book really upset me, or, how this book failed, things of that nature. So I'll be interested in watching those after the fact. And I think now I know why those titles are that way.
You think it's related to some of the issues that we're talking about here?
Yes, yeah. Ultimately, with our feelings of this second part, when I saw those videos, I wasn't sure how to feel about those titles, and this may be why.
All right, well, let us know in the comments below if you're having a similar experience with the text. We're brand new at this. We have very few subscribers, so if you can hit that subscribe button, that helps us out a lot. Lets us know that at least somebody out there in the void watched us for at least a second and justified the creation of this show. Do all of those things down below, and next time we will be finishing the text, and we will let you know what we think. Hopefully the ending can redeem it in our eyes at least, I guess, and push the rating above the 3 or 4 Amberites that I think we settled on out of 9. So again, thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.